All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Steve Wilson. We're at the new Bay House, To Be Bay House here in Lincoln City. It's March 6th, 2020. Thanks so much for joining us, Steve.
Thank you.
We'll start with the first question, most important question. Why wine? Why hospitality?
I'm not sure. I grew up in Iowa. The first job I could get in 8th grade was working at a drive-in, where if you did a good job when they closed the outdoor part in the winter, then you got promoted, and I got promoted to dishwasher, and that was close enough to where the cook was working, and I wanted to learn how to cook a burger, and one thing led to another, and somehow I ended up staying in the restaurant business, and I got to college at the University of Iowa, and started to realize that wine was a bigger part of what we were doing. I think the Italian restaurant I worked at in college had 13 or 14 wines on the list. We had red, white, and rosé. So it was pretty snappy. I took the only wine class that the University of Iowa offered. It was taught by a professor in the geology department. So consequently, he focused on soil and sun and exposure, and it was not especially exciting. A state school, we could not drink, even though it was an 18 state at the time. So there was, it was an interesting class, but not my favorite. And really, as I got finished with college, and I realized that a course of study in political science can lead you to grad school or a continuation in food and beverage, which I chose. And I had always wanted to come to Oregon. In fact, in the mid-'70s, I investigated coming to school at Oregon, and the difference between in-state and out-of-state tuition at that time, since I was paying, convinced me to be a Hawkeye rather than a Duck. And I'm embarrassed to say how inexpensive college used to be. To be a Hawkeye, I think it was $500 a year. That was 2 terms. And I think it was 10 times as much to be a Duck. Still a relatively a pittance these days, and I'm sorry that that's not the case anymore. But after college, I realized I was free to go, and I ended up in Portland, and I was at the Benson Hotel as a bartender, and opened Atwater's, which is now the Portland City Grill. Was there for 6 or 8 months, and one day a friend of mine said, "Oh, have you ever been to Salishan?" And I was like, "What's a Salishan?" So I found out it was at that time the only 5-star 5-diamond operation in the Northwest, and so I called Salishan and I said, "Hey, I'm in the food and beverage business, and I've never been to a 5-star 5-diamond resort before. I would love to come and take a tour." And they said, "Well, sure." So we made plans to drive out on a Saturday, and my friend Larry, who had first asked me if I'd been to Salishan, and I jumped in my van, and on the way, there were 2 or 3 wineries at that point, and we stopped at all of them, and we had a nice little buzz going. We were having a great time, and so we get to the resort, and I was met at the front desk, and they're like, "Oh, you're Steve. Well, great. Well, here, you go with this gentleman here, and they'll interview you, and then your friend Larry will keep him entertained down in the wine cellar." And I was like, "Interview? Wait, we stopped at 3 wine." I'm like, "Well, okay." So I spent the next 3 hours interviewing with everybody from Phil DeVito. Tim Tuffield was the restaurant manager. I interviewed with Janet Smith, who was HR, with Russ Cleveland, who was the general manager. I was kind of surprised, frankly. And at the end of that day, they said, "Well, we'd love to have you join our staff." So that's how I came to work at Salishan beginning in early 1983. My friend Larry was getting sauced down in the wine cellar, which at that time Phil had built up the collection to, I think we probably had, 2,500 different labels down there, of which only 1,700 were on the list. So it was a cellar aging program that was going on. And so I was happy to get the job, and my friend Larry was just happy. So we had a great time. So I joined the staff as a captain in the dining room, and I spent my daytimes working down in the wine cellar as the assistant cellar keeper. And that was really my first major exposure to wine. I learned an awful lot working next to Phil, and at that time Tom Brosey was the cellar keeper. He did a lot of the day-to-day work, and had originally been the guy who dug the cellar out from underneath the cedar tree event space. They kind of took over part of what had been the accounting department and started digging. And well, you've probably seen that cellar. It's an amazing piece of work and the real deal. So that was it was a really awesome opportunity for a kid from Iowa, who really, apparently they're making wine in Iowa now, but not at that time. So it was a pretty dramatic change.
I'm curious, as you were learning about wine, tell me about how you learned, and tell me about sort of Phil's influence on that.
Well, Phil was an amazing guy, and really more than just a great sommelier and waiter and public servant. He was a real gentleman, and he knew a lot about wine from a time when nobody cared. One of my favorite stories with Phil, we had an incredible selection of Great Grand Cru Bordeaux from the 1961 vintage. At that time, the vintage of the century, which he was buying for $10 a bottle. The accounting department said, "You're kidding, you paid $10 for one bottle of wine?" So we've come a long way. But being a program the caliber that we were, a lot of samples came our way. A lot of personal relationships with the fledgling Oregon wine industry. There was always 30 or 40 bottles of wine that should be opened and tasted. And pretty much every night after work, we would gather somewhere in the dining room, and Phil would open up 2 or 3 bottles and start talking about what he knew about wine and what he knew about the person who made it, or the processes, or the grapes, or the region. And really, after about 4 years of that, really felt like that was the best education a person can get. I mean, there's a lot to read, there's a lot to study, but unless you're getting wine to your lips, you really don't have the opportunity to comprehend all the details that wine entails. So I blame Phil for that. I also blame him for my addiction for a large wine list with a lot of options, a lot of selection, a lot of depth and breadth. And pretty much everywhere I went after I left Salishan in '88, establishing a wine program much larger than I had inherited always seemed to be a priority for me. But I saw the reaction that guests had to something that they hadn't seen before, that wine aficionados, the excitement that they had. I mean, I distinctly remember guests at Salishan who would check in and come down to the wine cellar and go through the list and talk with Phil or anybody down there and try to figure out how they were going to drink all these bottles of wine when they were only going to be there for 2 nights and 2 dinners. So, I always thought that was pretty inspirational and very successful wine program back then.
How did Phil build that? What was he? You talk about depth and breadth. Tell me about what was he looking for? How was he trying to build the collection?
Well, as I understand, Phil showed up in '72, and at that time, I think there were 8 or 10 selections on the wine list, the same sort of thing, and he brought this relatively unheard of wealth of knowledge and excitement and enthusiasm for wine. At some point, he convinced ownership, John Gray, to give him a commission and a budget, and that he would build a program and show that that made sense in a lot of ways, both for attracting guests and just sales of food and beverage. And as I understand, it didn't take him very long to build up the program. I think they dug the cellar out in the late 70s sometime. I'm not exactly sure when that was, but by then he had wine stashed under everybody's desk in every office, in the back room here, in the storage room there, and they finally decided that it made sense. But he built a program that was incredibly successful, and as I understand it, for quite a few years he made more money than anybody at Salishan, including the general manager, because his commission was good, and he ended up selling over $1 million worth of wine at a time when that was just unheard of, especially in a remote location like the Oregon coast. So there was he had drive and enthusiasm, and he would work the floor every night in the dining room. And Phil would never forget. We had a formula, if Phil helped sell wine, then you'd have to kick him down a percentage. It didn't seem like it was too much. It was maybe 5% of the wine sales or something like that. That man kept track. At the end of the night, he would show up and he'd go, "Well, I sold this much wine in your station." So yeah, Phil did okay.
Tell me about what your job entailed and what the Salishan experience was like as a guest at that time in the 80s.
Oh, yeah, great. Well, like I said, as the only 5-star, 5-diamond operation in the Northwest, it was a standout. I think he was one of the first Grand Award-winning wine programs in the country. And so that kind of focus attracted the kind of guests that we still like today, you know, the ones who are seeking a culinary destination. They want good food, they want good wine. They're interested in learning, but they already know a lot. And so that was kind of the attraction there. As far as the guests that we liked most often, lots of regulars who would be in the dining room, whether it was once a year or 4 times a year. It was, you know, Salishan did a really good job of promoting that personal touch where you were remembered. Alex Murphy, one of the first general managers there, long before computers, had a stack of 3x5 cards, and he noted specific personal information about each of his guests. Every afternoon prior to check-in, he'd be standing down in the lobby greeting these guests, and he'd be reviewing his cards. Oh, how is your daughter doing at Oregon? How is your son doing? And, you know, oh, did you finish that garage you were building? That kind of stuff. And that was the kind of hospitality that really appealed to me in a world that's become very automated and very formulaic. It was definitely out of the ordinary then, and I think it's even more out of the ordinary now. So that's inspired me to stay in hospitality. As far as what my job entailed back then as a bright-eyed 25-year-old waiter, well, working in the dining room, it was kind of an old-fashioned place. We had a lot of the tableside cooking was still going on. A couple of salads and 2 or 3 entrees were finished and 4 or 5 desserts. So being able to learn that and you know, schmooze your guests that way. Of course, I've said it for a long time, now that there's television, I mean, if you want to see explosions and fire, you can get that anytime. But in the olden days, if you wanted to see that, you had to be in a nice dining room with a waiter who knew what he was doing. So then, as I got more and more comfortable in the program, there was an opportunity to join the wine cellar staff, which at that time was a staff of 2, Phil as the guy, Tom Brosey as the cellar keeper, who basically did the physical work and the day-to-day menial receiving and stocking and whatnot. And so then there was a spot for an assistant to him, and so I guess that was me. I got to push the cart full of wine up the incline from the cellar up into the dining room to stock those areas every day. We did tours and tastings every day for the guests, so guests would sign up at the front desk, and then you would pick them up in the lobby and take them down and walk them through a veritable department store of wine. And there was, I think, about 36,000 bottles down in the cellar at that time. So it was an impressive stack. And then we'd sit down and cut up a little cheese and then expose people to the fledgling Oregon wine industry. And at the conclusion of said tasting, we'd taste 6 or 7 wines and yak it up. And then at the conclusion of the tasting, try to take advantage of the retail sales license that we had. So a lot of people would, you know, the Oregon wines, even back at the beginning, incredibly impressive. So it wasn't rare to, you know, hook somebody up with a case or 2 of wine on the way out. So that was pretty fun.
Tell me about the Oregon wine industry that as you got to know it, and who you were meeting through this job, and whose wines were being stocked there, and whose wines were selling there. Well, you know, Phil had his finger on the pulse way back when, but when I first got there, it wasn't rare to see David Lett there, and David Adelsheim, Richard Summer from down south a ways. Some of the pioneers that we had, Myron Redford was there a lot, and Dick Arath. And the Sokol Blossers. I mean, it's just a wonderful bunch of people who are still making fantastic wine, whether they're still directly involved or not. Their name has lived on, and the wines have gotten nothing but better. But at that time, it was kind of almost a secret. I mean, people were very surprised to find out that wines were being grown in Oregon, and even more surprised when they had a chance to sample the quality that was coming out. So, you know, I often joke that back then it was hard to find an Oregon wine that cost more than $10. Now, it's hard to find one that that is less than that you'd want to drink.
So it's been kind of fun to watch the industry come along. It's become a pretty big thing, and still is. I mean, people are still interested. Mostly, I think, because our production is small, and if you're from farther away than about the middle of the country, it's kind of hard to find some of our wines in some big markets. So people get out here and they're pretty surprised and impressed.
So tell me about what was I going to say there? We're going to cut that part out. I'm going to start the question over. What happened after you left Salishan?
Well, I guess Salishan was the first place that I worked that I had incredible respect for the management and ownership. And prior to that, my experiences with managers was they were either related to the owner, they didn't necessarily work their way into their position. I hadn't really had a chance to work with a lot of high-end professional hospitality people. And when I got to the Benson Hotel, Peter Egner was the maitre d' and dining room manager. He impressed me. They had a great collection at that time. I got out to Salishan, and that was really the first time that I saw like general management who was genuinely interested in hospitality. Shortly after I arrived, Russ Cleveland departed, and Hank Hickox arrived. And his sense of humor, his ability to talk with guests and not just hear the words they were saying, but hear the message they were conveying, and the fact that we were able to be out here in the middle of nowhere with a 5-star, 5-diamond operation with a world-class reputation, very inspiring to me. So after about 4 years in the dining room and the wine cellar, I made it clear that I was interested in a management opportunity. And sadly, Salishan was a place where once a person got a job, they rarely left. And so rather than have to wait around for somebody to die in a position that I would be interested in, I decided it was time to move on. So I think I became the only person to ever work at both 5-star, 5-diamond motels. And Salishan was considered a motel by AAA and by the Mobile Travel Guide at that time because you drove up to the rooms. The other one was Quail Lodge down in Carmel. So I accepted a food and beverage management position down there, and that, it got me away from the Northwest, which was the sad part. It was fun and interesting to be down in Carmel and on the Monterey Peninsula. It's a beautiful part of the world, and I'd probably still be there if I had like a 6-figure income, but I didn't. It's a very expensive place to be. I'm sure it's more expensive now. It was pretty expensive back in '88, and so I spent 10 or 12 months there. Then I accepted a position with Sheridan Corporation up in Tacoma, and that got me back to the Northwest, and that felt pretty good. And then from there I ended up back in Southern California for a while. I got to reopen the old Del Mar Hotel, and so that was kind of fun. I spent 5 years down in Southern California. Great place to visit. Never really seemed like home. So I got the opportunity to move back to Portland, and I did my second stint at the Benson Hotel as the public food and beverage manager there. Opened the Ruth's Chris Steakhouse in '97. Just kind of taking advantage of one of the few benefits of a career in food and beverage, which is you can go about anywhere and get a job about anywhere. You might not get rich, but there's definitely employment opportunities. And so I think these all kind of added to my knowledge and understanding of the philosophy of hospitality. I took a 2-year stint down in Miami. I worked for a Marriott operation down there, and so it was kind of nice. And one day, I was at the Eden Rock Renaissance Hotel in Miami Beach, and one day my boss there said, "I think that funny sounding place you used to work at on the Oregon coast is looking for an assistant general manager and director of food and beverage." And I was like, "Salishan? Like, no, nobody ever leaves Salishan. That couldn't be it." Well, it was true. I missed a lot in the 17 years I was gone. Spring Capital from Eugene had purchased the resort, and they flew me out, interviewed me, offered me the job, and it was kind of a dream come true for me to get back to Salishan in a management capacity, and that was in 2005. Sadly, it didn't take me long to realize that a lot had changed. No longer the 5-star, 5-diamond reputation. It had been through some pretty bumpy time and multiple ownership and management operations, and they really didn't have that spirit of hospitality that has so motivated me. So after about 6 or 7 months, I was approached by a guest at the resort who said, we're buying the Bay House, and we're looking for somebody to take a long-term lease with an ownership opportunity, and we think you'd do great. And I said, man, I am flattered, but never own a restaurant. I said, but they lived in Southern California. I said, but I'd be happy to help you find somebody. And so I got to know J.D. Boyd and his wife Maria over the course of about 5 months. And one day he just said, look, what would it take? We think you'd do great. I said, well, if the restaurant had a bar that I designed and you built, I'll sign on the line. And so that's how I came to sign the lease with J.D. and Maria Boyd. We got the lounge put on in the restaurant. I think he thought he would spend about $250,000 to get me to sign, and that's about what the construction of the building itself cost, the addition. And his wife wanted to play a part, so she selected $90,000 worth of furniture. And the riprap was failing, so I think that was another $250,000 to get that. And then, of course, the fire marshal said, now you've got to retrofit the building with a sprinkler system. That was apparently not cheap. I think he ended up spending about $700,000 basically to fulfill his part of the lease, was get me to sign. So I had a landlord for about 5 years until apparently money was not getting to the bank anymore, and that made him cranky, and we ended up with a mortgage in 2010.
So before we get to the Bay House, I'm curious on your other stops along the way. You talk about opening restaurants, and tell me what your role was at some of these places. Were you coming in, creating something from scratch? Were you reinventing something? What were you actually doing?
Yeah, well, being the food and beverage guy, which apparently most hospitality people and professionals stay away from. It's a lot of work. It's the biggest challenge of any hospitality operation, and it's not nearly as profitable as a rooms division. In fact, I spent a couple years as the night hotel manager at what was then the Fifth Avenue Suites in downtown Portland. It's now the Monaco. And I was amazed at how much easier it was to satisfy guests. If you gave them a room that they liked, that's the last you heard from them. It's not like food where it's like, this is cold, it's overdone, it's not the way I like it, it's can I get this with that kind of thing. So it was a lot more of a challenge. So the places that I showed up and got a chance to help open, it was just a matter of setting up the operation, working with the chef to do food because I am a lousy cook, but basically just lining things up so that they would operate. So I'd be in charge of the service staff, the wine and beverage program, and then working with the chef to deliver.
As you're building these wine lists, you talked about leaving every place with a lot more wine than when you got there. Tell me about building a wine program and what you took from Salishan and what you kind of gained along the way as it came to building a wine list.
It's a sickness, I think. It's like, I think in terms of any serious collection, it's hard to know when to say when. And again, it's the Phil DeVito disease, I think. But when I took over the Bay House, very respectable program there, about 250 selections on the wine list. And it just seemed like a natural progression that over the course of about the next 5 or 6 years, that selection grew to about 2,100 labels there for a while. And even as a small place, a small restaurant in a small corner of the state that's very seasonal, we definitely attracted our fair share of attention. We got some national publicity for the wine program through both the Wine Spectator and the Wine Enthusiast. And those kinds of accolades are nice. I'm not especially excited by awards, and as time goes on, I'm less and less excited by awards because they sort of seem like it's all, it's all about marketing and sales, and so oftentimes it doesn't have as much to do with the realities of the program as it does with who's got a good PR person and what's the marketing budget look like. But those kinds of things are always fun. It's good recognition for the staff. I think the recognition we were most excited about was the 4-diamond rating from AAA. There's only a couple other in our state and remains so. So that kind of recognition, I think, for a job well done is kind of the only payoff that comes along with a nice restaurant.
When you talk about a Four Diamond, what does that mean in terms of what are you offering that other places aren't? What is the rating entail?
Yeah. Well, as I understand it, about a third of it relates to quality and creativeness of food and the culinary presentation. About a third of it is based on service and attitude and philosophy, and the other third is basically on the comfort and the layout, the design, that sort of thing. So despite the fact that the Bay House was built in 1937, it was an accumulation of 4 or 5 different additions to what it was. Incredibly well maintained. I have a wonderful gal, Carrie Johnson, who has taken care of that place. I'm the third owner that she worked for. So for over 20 years, she maintained interior and exterior. She does paint. She is really good. I'm very blessed with a quality service staff that seem to get it, enjoy taking care of their guests. And again, it's that personal touch that is kind of disappearing these days. And again, a lot of things you can do when you're really small, as the Bay House was, but I probably answered 99% of the phone calls. I was there to greet the guests when they arrived, and I was the guy giving them their coat on the way out. And you just don't see that anymore, you know. Mm-hmm. And I did it mostly because I couldn't afford to have other people on hand and a great big staff for that. But again, it's that my personal achievement of being able to take care of people like that. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of kept me motivated all these years, and still does.
You talked about a couple times about your kind of service philosophy or hospitality philosophy, and you've kind of described it. But I'm curious if you could sum it up, what you would say is your hospitality philosophy, and how do you relay that to people who work for you?
Yeah. Well, if I had to put it in one sentence, I'd have to say it's nice people taking care of nice people. I don't. The mechanics of what I do and what the service staff does, I've said for a long time, you could teach a chimp to do it, but you couldn't necessarily teach a chimp to enjoy it. You couldn't necessarily teach a chimp to be personal. But, you know, taking orders and delivering food and presenting and serving wine, these are all very easy tasks. But to do it with a certain level of pride and panache and enjoyment goes a long way. So I've always been very lucky in selecting people who got it, who enjoyed what they did. It wasn't just a job where you do it, I can't wait to go home and do something else kind of a thing. Mm-hmm. So we have had some really long-term staff. I haven't always picked the right person, but mostly we've had really great people. So that's kind of it. A lot of times I see these days, especially now in the terms of social media becoming such a big thing, there's a lot more inclination of restaurateurs to sort of roll over and take it. And I think there are guests out there who think that if they complain about something, it'll be comped, and that's great because we all like to save money. At the same time, I can't do that. We're too small. We work too hard at what we're doing, and you know, I'm happy to apologize and make up for any mistakes that we made. But when we get some of these reviews that are posted by people who are obviously working it for an ulterior motive, I have a hard time standing up for that. I've written some what I consider to be fairly humorous yet pointed responses to some of those ads, or some of those reviews rather, and it's amazing, but I get a lot of people who come in and say, oh my God, we laughed so hard at this response. We went and read all your other responses, and you know, and so in that way it's kind of helped our marketing. Case in point, a couple of years back, we had a gentleman come in and he was pretty late to the game. We were not serving anymore, and but we said, if you'd be comfortable in the bar, we'd be happy to, the chef's still here. And so he ordered an entree from the dining room menu, the duck. It's fabulous. And apparently, after he had finished with his duck, he stood up in the bar and made a huge deal about how he was going to tell the world that we're serving chicken and calling it duck, because he knows the difference between chicken and duck. And we're like, okay, well, you know, you're entitled to your opinion, sir, but we don't have any chicken on the menu. There's not a chicken in. Anyway, so this occurred on a night when I was actually consulting with Salishan at that time, so I wasn't there for his departure. But apparently went right out in the parking lot because he posted an immediate review about, oh, these guys are serving chicken and calling it duck. And so my response to him was basically, I will give you $1 million if you can find a chicken in this restaurant. Not surprisingly, I never heard back from him, but I've had so many guests come in and go, oh my God, we were there that night, that guy blew up about the chicken and duck thing, and other people are like, man, that was just hilarious, did he ever get his $1 million? So that kind of stuff is kind of fun. It's a little aggravating when you get a review that you don't feel you deserve. And the process for me is first I lose sleep, and then I waste a couple hours crafting a response. And if I'm not giggling by the time I'm done, then I know it isn't quite right to post. So that's pretty much my plan. And luckily we don't get very many of those.
When it comes to making your wine list, I'm curious what you're looking for in a wine that you're going to serve. Is it filling a niche? Is it a certain price point? Is it a certain style or varietal or country? Or is it how does it fit? Why do you choose some wines over others?
Well, it's kind of a combination of those things, I think, and certainly being in the Northwest, we want to have a good selection of wines from the Northwest. I think our program currently about 35% of the list is from the Northwest. Thank God Washington is producing some great Cabernets, and the Oregon wines being a little more delicate and equally wonderful, which is great. There's a personal aspect to it as well. We want to help the winemakers that have helped Oregon, and certainly there's loyalties for me, for the staff, and for guests. You want to see some names on your list, and I've got a lot of personal respect for some of those pioneers who got the ball rolling and are still making great wine. So now that I'm apparently much older, I see wine lists of Oregon wines with lots of wineries I don't recognize, and I see a lot of the pioneers that are no longer represented. And I understand it's a fashion thing, and you oftentimes want to be at the forefront of fashion. We try to feature things that have a foundation both in this area and worldwide to sort of build on. And I'm always happy to help a winemaker who's new at the game. We typically get approached, and I'm always happy to buy a case of wine and give it a whirl. It isn't a big risk for me to add one more wine to the list or feature it as a by the glass sort of a thing. As far as within varietals, it's nice to have a broad range from the more delicate Pinot Noirs, the more Burgundian style, the bigger, richer, more California type things. Just being able to have a selection for guests. A lot of times guests are looking for specific labels, things they've read about, or things they may not be able to get, or just things that they're familiar with. So sometimes that determines why I'll put a wine on a list, if it has good name recognition. It's kind of interesting, Mondavi is a great example. There was a time, 20 years ago, you had to have a lot of Mondavi wines on the list because they were very well known and people showed up and that's what they were looking for. We still have some. We still have some of the reserve wines and some of those old Cabernets that are fantastic. But it's amazing, very few people are looking for a Mondavi wine these days, even though some of them are pretty tremendous. They've gone through their own, familial turmoil over the years and various ownership changes and whatnot. So that probably affects their marketing and the loyalty that they once commanded. But some of those older wines are still terrific, and it's there's no reason that they can't make good wine, and they still do make good wine. But now there's 800 wineries in Napa Valley or something, so they don't really command the percentage of mind that they used to. But just an example. And the same thing is happening in Oregon. There's a lot of wine lists in a lot of nice places where I would expect to see Irie wines. I mean, some of those Pinot Noirs are amazing, and for whatever reason, they're not as well represented in some places that I think they should be. But I'm doing my part.
So tell me about at the Bay House specifically, and now as you're sort of moving the Bay House, the transition here. Why do people come? Why would people come to the Bay House? Why are they going to come here? What is it you offer that other places along the coast don't offer necessarily?
Well, I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fabulous location, and that I think is important to some people. It's not so important to me, and I've often thought that a great restaurant could be a great restaurant whether it has a beautiful view or whether it's in a basement with no windows. It's really about food, service, and the experience. That being said, it's really nice to have a beautiful location that the Bay House enjoyed for the first 41 years of its existence. I'm very excited about the new location because we have a pretty tremendous view here as well. But it's not the main thing that I'm looking for in the restaurant. I really think that people are equally attracted to good food, creative and inventive food. The wine list plays a big part in that because there is a big selection. There's a great opportunity to experiment and learn. And more than anything, I think it's the personal touch. People like to be recognized. They like to be appreciated. They like that, that sort of, the personalized style, I guess. There's plenty of franchised restaurants around. Everything's very formulaic. You may like the menu; it's the same at every place. You may like the attitude. They work that to be similar. But I think there's something to be said for something that is unique, a one-off. Just an old guy out here trying to do what he thought would basically, I guess, in the end, would satisfy me, would be the kind of place that I would be interested in being in, that's comfortable and friendly and lighthearted, and we tend to deal with everything with humor, because fun is really what it's all about for me and life in general as I see it. So even if we have an issue, we try to be humorous. You can think of here's a humorous story from the Bay House. I had a guest call me over in the bar once to complain about a foreign object that he'd found in a crab cake. And I looked at it and I thought, that looks like a part of a tooth. And I said, how's your teeth? Are all your teeth? I'm fine, yeah. My teeth are fine. Those are my. So I'm like, I'll be right back. I had a guest in the dining room who was a dentist. So I said, pardon me, sir. I wonder if you would mind taking a look at this. A guest found this, and what do you think? He looked at it and goes, oh, that's off a molar. And I'm like, okay. And so I went back to the guy and said, look, I don't want to be argumentative, and I'm certainly happy to take this item off of your check, but I have a dentist in the dining room who said that's part of a tooth. He said, oh, my teeth are just fine. About 3 days later, he called me back. He goes, I'm missing a part of a tooth. So I thought that was kind of funny. So, you don't want to get too upset.
Had you saved the part of the tooth for him?
I did not. After that, I figured, nobody's going to use this again.
So you're moving to this smaller space after so many years at the original Bay House location. Yeah. Tell me sort of what prompted the move and what you're going for here at the new space.
Well, I guess what prompted the move was my partner suggesting it as an option. This had been their second home for the last 12 years, and we're now working with the county to get special permission to do what we want to do up here, which is, again, be very small, focus on the special occasions that we're kind of noted for, and again, doing something that's spectacular and unique. This is a wonderful location on 36 acres overlooking the entire bay, so it's kind of a no-brainer. We keep the name. It took a while, but we got the phone number transferred up here finally. We had to switch phone companies. I guess that's a little dicey. But the opportunity to have guest rooms, I think, will go a long way towards us mitigating the downside of a very long off-season on the coast. So if we can continue to be the culinary destination that we are with some guest rooms, then I think that goes a long way to helping us make our business successful. And the fact that we'll have a chance to get even smaller means I think that we'll be even more responsive, going from a kitchen staff of 6 or 7 down to a kitchen staff of 3. Those people work very well together, not having to have menus that we're uncertain how our night's going to go. For example, at the Bay House, we had a terrific and very well-priced bar menu. And in addition to a small a la carte menu in the dining room and a 5-course tasting menu option. So you never really know how your night's going to go. Whether everybody's going to be in the bar having a burger, or everybody's going to be in the dining room doing the 5-course tasting menu, it's a little iffy, and you have to be ready for that. Moving to a small place like this, well, with no bar menu, sadly no hamburger, it was good, but we envision doing a 7-course tasting menu up here in a kind of a dinner party format, where guests will have the chance to not only experience the new place, have a personal contact with the staff, but also with their fellow diners. And in that way, I think it's kind of speaks to hospitality as a way to bring people together and sharing food, breaking bread, as it were. Always a great opportunity to make a really special experience. And so that is our hope, that we're able to proceed there and work with the county and the zoning laws and get special permission to do something special.
And of course, offer an expansive wine list.
A lot of wine. Yeah, moving from a spot where we're probably going to be about, if I had to guess business-wise, we'll probably be about 20% the size. We have a long, winding driveway, so we got to be careful with the wine consumption, of course. But I have a wine program that will definitely service a much larger restaurant than we will be. So yes, that'll be interesting. I'll be excited when we finally get to the point where I can start buying wine again. We're kind of in a consumption phase, as it were. But the accumulation phase is fun too.
You've talked a bit about sort of seeing wine lists now with wines you don't recognize, wineries you don't recognize. Obviously, the industry has grown tremendously since you've been here and since you've been in the restaurant business. I'm curious, from your perspective, what does the industry look like now? What does Oregon wine look like now in 2020? And maybe where do you think it's going in the future?
Boy, good question. I don't know. You know, it's interesting. It almost reminds me of what the beer industry is going through. You know, we went from very few breweries 30 years ago to now there's a brew pub on every corner. And so I think we're starting to see a washout. The market has sort of become saturated. There's just so much to choose from that, you know, things are becoming either smaller, they're selling out to larger organizations, or they're just going out of business. I don't know if that's necessarily where the Oregon wine industry is at this point, but it is interesting to see California buying into the Oregon wine experience and what that offers. I think now California Concern is the largest land, vineyard, and winery owner in our state. I think that puts pressure sometimes on the smaller producers to produce more, to market better, to go farther. And so far I haven't seen where that's been a big problem, where, you know, trying to get bigger too fast and you sacrifice quality and you know, try to make the business work at the expense of the uniqueness and the quality that, you know, maybe got them there, you know, where they are now. Mm-hmm. I don't see that as being a big problem at this point, but I can see where it could become a problem. Mm-hmm. The consolidation that's going on. I mean, at some point there will be too many wineries. I don't know where that point is or what that will be, but my hope is that those wineries are happy to remain small and, you know, feed their niche and work on quality. I think, you know, again, getting back to Irie Vineyards, I think they're very true to that original vision that David had, which I think they're still just a 5,000 case a year production operation, and they're very focused on quality. The next generation is doing a great job with that, and I don't know, I think that's the roadmap that a lot of smaller wineries are following, but there is consolidation. There is, you know, every time the Jackson Estate people show up in the state, they're kind of like, you're a millionaire, you're a millionaire, you're a millionaire, we'll take all this and add it to our portfolio. And I was kind of hoping that they were interested in a nice restaurant on the Oregon coast, but so far not. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, it's exciting times as the next generation moves on, and I think we're kind of on the cusp of the third generation. You know, Dad started it, the son ran it, now his kids are getting involved, and so it's very interesting. It's also interesting to see, you know, what the climactic shift is going to do for the Oregon wine industry. I mean, I sure hope we don't get hot enough to do Cabernet at some point. But again, it's interesting to see California wine producers moving this way, because the writing's on the wall. There'll be a time when California won't be as conducive to the kind of reds that they've, established, and maybe the same will happen for Oregon. I hope we maintain our delicate climate, because the Pinot Noirs are outstanding. They're not going to do well if we get hot. So.
And what about for you? Obviously, you're in the period of a pretty big transition right now. What's in the future? What do you see as you're looking ahead for yourself and for your restaurant?
Well, again, I guess getting the permit to serve food is big, and it's not going to be as easy as we thought, but we are moving ahead. We've got a land use attorney working with us on that, and I'm trying to get the county on our side to do something special and small. I think that goes a long way. Beyond that, gosh, you never really know. We've kind of kept our eyes open to see if there might be another location that we might operate out of in the interim, if this ends up being a couple-year battle to get our permit. I'm always interested in anything I can do to help promote the local tourism and the local quality factor, restaurant-wise. I think Lincoln City in particular, we kind of have this reputation of being kind of the t-shirt and taffy crowd, and consequently everything, lots of restaurants, if it can be frozen and deep fried, they got it. And for me, that's not very exciting. I like seeing what's going on. Salishan is making some great strides in getting back on the right track, I think. There's some new operations around that, got my fingers crossed that they'll be, into more than just clam chowder and cheeseburgers. So yeah, always hoping to help in that regard.
That's all the questions that I have for you today. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have asked? Anything we should have covered?
Gosh, I can't think of a thing. That was really fun.
Excellent. Thank you. For us too, obviously. Really appreciate your time, your stories today, and we'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
Well, you go a long way to making a guy who's not very important feel important, so thank you for that. And I hope this thing's okay.